Hi, my name is Lisa, and today I'd like to share with you a few tips to help make your next sewing project a success. Let's get started. So beginning sewers often find it very difficult to sew a simple straight line because it's anything but simple. It's difficult and it requires practice, just like anything that you want to be successful at. But here's a tip that you might find helpful. I will take a piece of plain blue painter's tape and mark the seam allowance on my machine or their machine, because this tape will release without leaving any glue residue on your machine, so you don't have to worry about that. But mark the seam allowance. For most modern patterns, it's 5/8 of an inch. And while there is a mark on my foot plate at 5/8 of an inch, sometimes it's difficult to gauge where that mark actually is down here when I get farther down on the machine. So I'll take my piece of blue painter's tape and I'll line it up right along with that 5/8 inch mark, and I will come straight down the side of this machine. And now I've elongated that line. So when I go to sew my straight seams, I can make sure that I line up that edge with my painter's tape edge to keep my seams as straight as possible. So sewing a straight stitch with what I just put together for you, and I'm going to actually throw a couple of pins in here. So let's take a quick second and talk about proper pinning. I know this is something that a lot of people take for granted as, oh yeah, of course, you just put the two pieces of fabric together. But there's actually a few little tricks to it. First of all, I want to make sure I line it up correctly. So I want to make sure that the top piece of fabric and the bottom piece of fabric are actually lined up very nicely. Now, when I put my pins in, I don't want to just jam it in straight, because what's going to happen is when I tilt this pin up to push it back through the other side, now I've just made the top piece, I don't know, you can see that, marginally longer than the back piece. So what I want to do when I'm pinning is to put my pin in at the angle so I don't actually have to twist it to get it to put those two pieces of fabric together. So again, I'm not putting my pin in straight down into the fabric. I'm putting it at an angle down into the fabric like this. So I'm matching up my lines, making sure, and I'm putting it down in an angle like this. And I'm going to pin. This fabric doesn't move a whole lot, so I really wouldn't even need many pins at all. But I'm going to pin every inch, 2 inches, until I get used to how this fabric is going to move. So there I've got my pins. Now you'll notice where I put the heads of the pins, I like to put them out. These are actually quilting pins, but I find them easier to grab. I put the heads of the pins toward the outside of my seam allowance. And the reason I did that is when I put this underneath the machine, I'm going to pull those pins as I sew. Now, could I have put them the other direction? Sure, I could have put them this direction and then I pull them with the other hand. I'm right-handed, so I have a tendency to find it more comfortable to pull the pins with my right hand. So I'd throw my pin bowl over here. And as I set up my machine to sew, I'm going to line up my fabric with my painter's tape. I'll drop a couple of stitches first, then I'll do my back tack. So I'll drop a couple of stitches. I'll do my back tack, 2, 3, and then I'm going to sew. Now before my needle gets to that pin, I'm going to pull it. Before my needle gets to this next pin, I'm going to pull it. Before my needle gets to this next pin, you get the idea. And I'm following along my piece of fabric along with this blue painter's tape. And I'm pulling my pins as I go. As I approach the end, then I'm going to hit my backward button, my back tack button, or my back stitch, give a couple of back stitches, release my needle, and I'll show you. I'll show you that nice straight line that we were able to sew following along with that painter's tape. So the next thing I wanted to show you was, how do I use this as a curve? How do I sew? Yes, I've mastered my straight lines. Now I need to master my curves. So I'm going to take that same piece of fabric that I was using, and now I'm going to use this other side that I have a slight curve into the fabric on. And I'm going to try to match this up with a straight edge. This is a little bit more of an advanced technique, but I'm going to pin it the exact same way that I was doing earlier. I'm going to match up my edges. I'm going to put my pin in at an angle along the seam line. So I know my seam line is going to be in here because we're 5/8 of an inch. That's how I've marked my machine. Now as a curve, I may want to use a few more pins, and I want to make sure that I'm following my pins along with the curve that I'm doing. So here's my next pin. I've got everything lined up. Manipulate that fabric, push it up so that I can see that they're lined up at the top here. Next layer of pins, and final pin right here at the end. So as I put this under the machine, I'm going to put it under the same way, put my tails to the back, line up this very first bit that I'm going to put under the presser foot first with my painter's tape. Don't worry that this tail is off. That's okay, because remember, we're sewing a curve. So again, I'm going to drop a first couple of stitches, 1, 2. I'm going to do a back tack, 1, 2, 3. Here I go. Pull my first pin, and now I'm watching right here that as this fabric is getting close and underneath the foot of the machine, I'm making sure that I'm following that painter's tape along this edge right here. Following, and here comes a little bit more of the curve. I'm going to flatten out and make sure that I'm not getting any puckers as I'm sewing this curve. Here I come. I'm following this painter's tape. Here I come again. I'm going to pull this pin. Last but not least, now I know that back piece is already finished, so I'm going to give myself a back tack. I know it doesn't look like it's already to the end, but it really is. So here I go with my snips, and here is my beautiful curve. And look what happened as I opened this up. Now this is an example of how you would form like a princess seam in the bodice of a gown, where you have these gentle curves, and it makes the fabric sit up, see? Because it's got that nice curve into it. So sewing curves, sewing straight lines, your painter's tape is your friend, and you can adjust this because again, it doesn't stick. It sticks to the machine, but it doesn't leave a residue. If my seam allowance was a different width, I can change it just as easily. Just make sure you measure from your needle to where the edge of your painter's tape is to get your proper seam allowance, whether it be a 1/2 inch seam allowance or 5/8 or even 3/8 seam allowance. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you feel like you've missed anything, feel free to rewind this video and rewatch it as many times as you need. To dive even further into your next sewing adventure, feel free to hop into a live class. I'll see you next time.